The sound of cold metal locking shut echoes through the dusty room like a gunshot, instantly silencing the police sirens outside. Click. It is a final, irrevocable sound. In the center of the room stands CEO James. The man who once gave up billions to protect this woman is now the very person holding the key to her destruction. He is not fighting the police. He is not shielding her. He is the one pressing the steel cuffs onto Diep's trembling wrists. Diep stares up at him, her eyes wide with a shock so profound it feels like death. She searches his face for a sign, a wink, anything to tell her this is a trick to fool the world. But she finds nothing. James's face is a mask of stone. He leans in close, lips brushing her ear, and whispers the words that will haunt her forever. Stop acting innocent. It's pathetic. I know you did it. To understand this hell, we must rewind 30 minutes. Just half an hour ago, this house was a sanctuary. Diep was humming in the kitchen while James guided little Nee's fingers as she practiced writing. It was a fragile paradise built on the ruins of their struggles. But destruction arrived not with a knock, but with a crash. The wooden door splintered inward, kicked open by a heavy boot. Nye screamed, dropping her pencil, and buried her face in James's chest. James stood up instantly, ready to fight thugs. But it wasn't thugs. It was the police. 4 officers swarmed the space, overturning the table. Behind them, walking with the gait of a conqueror, was Mr. Hoan. He looked out of place in the humble shack, his Italian suit pristine. But he wasn't alone. Rushing past him was Mrs. Hoan, James's mother. She looked disheveled, clutching Hoan's arm, begging him to stop. She screamed that he promised to leave the children alone. But Hoan shook her off like dust, his eyes fixed on Diep with pure hatred. The police chief stepped forward, holding a warrant. He barked out the accusation: grand larceny. The Blue Moon diamond necklace, worth 10 billion dong, had vanished from the Hoan estate. An anonymous tip claimed the thief was hiding here. James laughed. He towered over the chief, calling this ridiculous. He accused his father of framing an honest woman with a cheap trick. Mrs. Hoan rushed to Diep, hugging her tight. She told the officers Diep would never steal a grain of rice. She pleaded with her husband, asking how he could destroy his son's happiness. Hoan didn't answer. He pointed his cane at a pile of toys in the corner. He ordered the police to check the bear. An officer grabbed Nee's favorite teddy bear, the one Diep had stitched up with love. Nye cried out, reaching for it, but the officer ignored her. He slashed the bear open with a knife. Stuffing flew like snow. Then a heavy object fell from the cotton and hit the floor with a clatter. It shone with a brilliant blue light. The Blue Moon necklace. The silence was deafening. Diep gasped, shaking her head violently. She stammered that she had never seen it before. Mrs. Hoan froze, realizing the depth of her husband's cruelty. She screamed at him, calling him a monster. But Hoan remained calm. He stated the law. Grand larceny carries a sentence of 20 years. He looked at James, who stared at the necklace in disbelief. The trap was clumsy, but legally it was lethal. The police moved to arrest Diep. James lunged, grabbing an officer. "Let her go!" he roared. But Mr. Hoan stepped in. He didn't yell. He walked up to James and whispered a low hiss only his son could hear. He gave James a choice, a deal with the devil. He said James could fight. If he did, Diep would go to prison for 20 years, and James would go to jail for assaulting an officer. And Nye? With both parents incarcerated, the child would be sent to the state orphanage, lost and alone. Or James could end it now. If James personally handed Diep over, denounced her, and returned to the mansion, Hoan would make the charges disappear by morning. Diep would spend one night in a cell as a warning, then go free. James looked at his mother, sobbing helplessly on the floor. He looked at Nye, trembling in terror. He looked at Diep, begging him to save her. He realized he couldn't save her by fighting. He could only save her by destroying her. To keep her out of prison, he had to break her heart so completely she would never look back. He had to become the villain. The light in James's eyes died. A cold resolve took its place. He pushed his mother away gently. He walked to the table. He picked up the necklace, dangling it in front of Diep. He raised his voice for all to hear. He asked if his love wasn't enough. He accused her of greed, claiming he saw her eyeing the jewelry weeks ago. He called her a thief. Diep looked at him in shock, unable to process the betrayal. Mrs. Huyen grabbed James's arm, shaking him, asking what was wrong with him. James shook his mother off, sneering. He said he was tired of poverty and lies. He demanded the police take her away. Then he took the handcuffs from the officer. He walked up to Diep. He saw her trust shatter. He clicked the metal around her wrists. He leaned in and delivered the final blow, whispering that she was nothing but a mistake. As the police dragged a screaming Diep out, Mrs. Huyen collapsed, clutching her chest. Nee wailed, a sound of pure abandonment. James stood still. He didn't look back. He watched the police car drive away. Mr. Hong clapped a hand on his shoulder, praising him, then walked out victorious. Only when the room was empty of intruders did James move. He locked the door. He slid down the wall until he hit the floor. He buried his face in his hands, and a sound ripped from his throat, a guttural scream of agony. He punched the floor until his knuckles bled. He crawled to Nai, trying to hug her, but the child flinched away in fear. That rejection cut deeper than any knife. He whispered a vow into the empty air. He promised to burn his father's empire to the ground to get her back. The heavy iron door of the holding cell slammed shut with a clang that reverberates deep in Diep's bones. The sound marks the end of her life. The cell is cold, smelling of damp concrete and despair. A flickering bulb casts dancing shadows against the peeling paint. Diep sits on the narrow bench, knees pulled to her chest, shivering from shock. She stares at her wrists. The red marks left by the handcuffs are visible, angry and raw. But the physical pain is nothing compared to the agony in her chest. Every time she blinks, she sees James's face. Not the man who loved her, but the stranger who framed her. "I know you did it," he had said. Those words loop in her mind. She touches the spot on her ear where his lips brushed. It burns. How could he? How could the man who promised a future be the one to destroy it? Was she just a toy for a bored billionaire? The betrayal crushes her lungs. She thinks of Nee, alone and terrified, and tears spill over, hot and silent. She is trapped in a nightmare, and the monster chasing her wears the face of the man she loves. Across the city, the atmosphere in the Huan mansion is stifling. Crystal chandeliers sparkle with a brilliance that hurts the eyes. Dinner is served on fine porcelain, but James feels like he is eating ash. He sits at the mahogany table, dressed in a fresh suit that feels like a straitjacket. His hands, scrubbed clean, still feel stained. At the head of the table sits Mr. Huan, cutting a steak with surgical precision. He looks satisfied, like a general who won a war without firing a shot. Next to James sits Mrs. Huyen. She is pale, eyes swollen, picking at her food. She looks at her son with confusion and disappointment that pierces James's heart. She cannot understand why her son would do such a monstrous thing. Huan raises his wine glass, the red liquid swirling like blood. He toasts to rationality. He tells James he did well. Severing a rotten limb is painful, but necessary. He talks about stocks in the future, as if he didn't just ruin lives. James grips his fork until his knuckles turn white. He wants to scream. He wants to strangle the man sitting across from him, but he forces himself to swallow the rage. He has to play the part. He reminds his father of the promise. The charges must be dropped by morning. Huan smiles, cruel and thin. He assures James he is a man of his word. The necklace was found in the garden. A mistake. Diep will be released at dawn, but Juan adds a condition. James must never see her again. If he goes to her, if he sends money, the charges will be reinstated, and the sentence will be life. James nods, face impassive. He agrees. He excuses himself and walks to his room, the room he hasn't slept in for months. The luxury feels suffocating. He looks out at the city lights. Somewhere in a cold cell, Diep hates him. She has to hate him to survive. He pulls out his phone. The wallpaper is a photo of him, Diep and Nee laughing. He stares at it, memorizing their smiles before deleting it. He throws the phone against the wall. It shatters. He falls onto the bed, tears finally escaping. He is back in his golden cage, but his soul is dead. Dawn breaks gray over the city. The heavy gates of the police station creak open. Diep steps out. She looks like a ghost. Her clothes are wrinkled, eyes hollow. The world looks grayer, sharper. She stands on the sidewalk, shivering. She has no money, no phone. She expects to see James. A foolish part of her hopes he will explain. And he is there. A black luxury car is parked across the street. The window rolls down. James sits in the back, but he doesn't get out. He just watches her with cold eyes. Next to him sits Mr. Juan, looking impatient. Diep steps forward, lips forming his name. James signals the driver. The driver steps out with a duffel bag. He drops it at Diep's feet. He delivers a message for all to hear. Mr. James sends this for her trouble, enough to start a new life far away. He warns her never to contact the family again. Diep looks at the bag. It is full of money. Money to pay for her broken heart. She looks at James. He holds her gaze, unreadable, masking the agony inside. Something in Diep snaps. Sadness evaporates, replaced by fury. She kicks the bag away. She screams at the car. She tells James she doesn't want his dirty money. She will never forgive him. She yells that he is just like his father, a monster. She vows he will regret this. She turns and walks away. She walks away from the money, the car, the man she loved. She walks with her head high, tears streaming down. Inside the car, James watches. His hand clenches his knee, drawing blood. He wants to jump out, to beg, but Mr. Juan watches like a hawk. Juan nods, saying the girl finally showed pride. He tells the driver to go. As the car pulls away, James watches Diep shrink in the rearview mirror until she disappears. Mrs. Huyen, silent until now, speaks up. Her voice is weak but filled with venom. She tells Juan he destroyed his son. She says money cannot buy what James lost. Juan laughs, but James isn't listening. He reaches into his pocket. His fingers close around a crumpled paper, the receipt for the pawn shop where the real necklace was sold weeks ago by his father's mistress. He found it in Juan's office. He didn't frame Diep. His father did, using a replica while selling the real one for gambling debts. James has proof. He couldn't use it yesterday without risking Diep. But now, the game has changed. The car stops at a red light. James looks out the window. His eyes are dry. Sorrow is gone, replaced by cold determination. He sacrificed his heart to save Diep. Now he will sacrifice his humanity to take everything from his father. He will destroy the company from the inside. He whispers a silent promise. Wait for me, Diep. The light turns green. The car speeds forward. The love story is over. The war of vengeance has begun.
James buộc phải lựa chọn tàn nhẫn nhất đời mình để cứu Diệp và Nhi. Khi ông Hoang gài bẫy, giấu chiếc vòng cổ kim cương và hồng thú bông của Nhi rồi gọi cảnh sát ập vào. Diệp bị tội vu trộm cắp với án tù 20 năm trước lựa chọn địa ngục chống lại để cả anh và Diệp vào tù. Nhi bị đưa vào trại trẻ mồ côi hay tự tay mình phản bội người yêu để cứu họ. James chấp nhận trở thành kẻ ác. Anh công khai buộc tội Diệp, đích thân còng tay cô, xé nát niềm tin và trái tim cô để đổi lấy một đêm giam giữ tượng trưng. Diệp ra tù với nỗi hận sâu sắc, từ chối tiền và quay lưng rời đi. Trong im lặng, Diêm phát hiện bằng chứng cha mình mới là kẻ bán vàng thật. Tình yêu chấm dứt, một cuộc chiến trả thù bắt đầu.